David and Aaron, 13-year-old twin brothers, had always been close with their mother. She was their support, their protector, their home. But when they returned after 3 months of staying at their grandmother's house, something about their home and their mother was drastically different. The car accident changed everything. A truck had slammed into Amanda's car on an icy road, leaving her barely alive among the twisted metal. The boys had heard from their grandmother that her face had suffered severe injuries and required multiple surgeries. Amanda would go through a long recovery process, but no story had prepared them for what awaited them at home. When they arrived, the house greeted them with a heavy silence. Once cozy and bright, it now seemed empty and grim. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the air smelled of dust and stagnation. Every corner seemed filled with a shadow that swallowed up all the light. Amanda appeared in the doorway. Her figure seemed thinner than before, and her face was entirely covered with thick white bandages. The only thing left visible were her eyes, which seemed to burn a hole through everything they looked at. Her posture was sharp, and her movements clumsy, as though her body was no longer used to its own muscles. "You're back, finally," she said, her voice low and raspy. The boys froze, for this voice was nothing like the one their mother used to sing them lullabies. At dinner, Amanda sat off to the side, not touching her food, only silently watching the brothers. Her eyes seemed to study them, like a predator examining its prey. David tried to joke to break the tension, but his words seemed to drown in the thick, sticky silence. That first night, David woke to a strange sound. Heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. He lay still, afraid to even breathe. The footsteps stopped by their bedroom door. He heard someone gently press the doorknob, but the door remained shut. After a while, the sound faded, and David lay wide-eyed, counting the minutes until dawn. In the morning, he mustered the courage to talk to his mother. She stood by the window, clutching a piece of cloth in her hands, which she sharply tossed aside when David spoke. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, trying to hide the fear in his voice. Amanda slowly turned around, and he felt his heart skip a beat. Her eyes, visible through the bandages, were cold, almost animalistic. She stepped closer, and before he could say anything, she grabbed his arm. Her fingers were thin, like steel wires, squeezing his wrist so hard that he cried out. "Don't ask stupid questions," she hissed, leaning into his face. Her breath was hot and uneven, and moisture seeped from the edges of her bandages, leaving dark stains on the fabric. Meanwhile, Aaron began hearing strange sounds at night. They came from the basement. There were dull thuds, the scraping of metal, and something like quiet, suffocating groans. One night, driven by curiosity, he descended with a flashlight in hand. The basement greeted him with cold and dampness. At the bottom of the stairs stood heavy doors locked with a coated lock. As Aaron approached, he heard a sound, like someone breathing slowly behind the door. "What are you doing here?" His mother's voice came from behind him, freezing him in place. He slowly turned and saw her. Amanda stood on the stairs, her face still hidden behind bandages, but her posture was one of someone preparing to attack. "This place isn't for you. If you want to live, stay away from it." Her voice was low, almost growling, and every word hit his heart. Trembling, Aaron climbed back up. He couldn't explain it to David, but now he was certain. This was not their mother. The brothers began to notice that something was off, but they grew most concerned when their mother imposed strict new rules. She forbade them from leaving their room at night. "Night is dangerous," she would say, her eyes dark, as if she feared something or someone. Every time they broke this rule, she would look at them as if their lives depended on not questioning her reasons. Another rule was that they couldn't use their phones without permission. This rule felt so strange it seemed almost absurd. Their mother insisted they leave their phones in her room at night, even if they needed to contact someone. "You never know who might call," she would repeat whenever David or Aaron asked about it. Another rule was that she forbade them from talking to strangers. Every time someone came to the door, their mother grew tense. She would prevent the brothers from speaking with anyone, even if they were familiar neighbors or family friends. "These people are dangerous. Don't trust anyone," she would sternly order, staring them down as if trying to break their resolve. The rules seemed ridiculous, even childish, yet the way she presented them was frighteningly serious. Her cold gaze and relentless determination instilled more fear than any conversation could. But what truly terrified the brothers was when, a few days after these new rules, their mother suddenly left the house. She said she had business to take care of, and their home became even darker and emptier. David and Aaron snuck into their mother's bedroom, slowly opening the drawer of her desk where she always kept old photographs, reminders of the past. The boys hadn't planned on finding anything unusual, but ever since they returned home, everything had felt off. Their mother's behavior was strange, cold, ominous, almost foreign. David couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something wasn't right, so they decided to look for any clue. As Aaron flipped through the old photos, one image caught his attention right away. It was a picture from the accident scene. The car, unfortunately, was nearly unrecognizable, severely damaged, crushed. But what caught his eye was what was in the back seat. A woman. It seemed like it should have been their mother. But as David looked closer, something inside him froze. This was not her. The woman in the photo had similar facial features, hair, even the posture resembled their mother's, but her expression was cold, utterly merciless. There was something wrong with her eyes. They were a different color, and they seemed to look at them emptily, like they were dead. She looked like their mother, but she wasn't her. David couldn't explain what made him feel such a visceral rejection, but every inch of his skin seemed to scream that something was terribly wrong. The look in this woman's eyes in the car was barely recognizable. Something human had been lost in her expression. It was as if she didn't belong in this reality. What disturbed him even more was the absence of any wounds or bloodstains on her face. This meant that either she hadn't been hurt as badly as they thought, or something else. Aaron's heart was pounding like a heavy hand had pressed down on him. He slowly placed the photograph back on the desk, sliding his fingers over its edges, almost as if trying to find some logic. But there were no answers. The idea that their mother, after the accident, could have been someone else, a stranger, someone in her place, began to consume their minds. Thoughts blurred together in a terrifying picture. Was this just trauma that had changed her behavior? Or perhaps was it part of something much worse? Aaron looked at his brother. David said nothing, but it was hard not to notice how their mother was changing. And tonight, they couldn't leave this unanswered. Stealing the keys to the basement from their mother was a decision they hadn't discussed. Aaron simply grabbed them from her purse while she slept. With every passing minute, his heart raced faster. "We have to do this, David," he said, trying to convince himself that everything would be okay. As the darkness swallowed the house and their mom was already in her room, the boys quietly sneaked down to the basement. They didn't speak, only glancing at each other now and then, knowing that this could be their salvation or their end. The basement was suffocatingly silent. The air was heavy and stale, like an old, abandoned place where no living person ever came. The flashlight gently slid over the dark walls, illuminating crooked, faded shelves. The basement, which they had always avoided, was now the only place that might hold answers to their questions. And there, among the dust and old boxes, the boys noticed something strange. Several large plastic bags that didn't look like trash. They were tightly packed, and through the gaps, something heavy and wrong was visible inside. Do you see this?" David whispered, but Aaron was already by the bag. He shook it, and the moment he tried to open one of the bags, his heart nearly stopped. Inside was a part of a human body, and it wasn't just a torn arm or leg. The pieces, wrapped in plastic, seemed not to belong to a living person. The blood had dried, but the smell, that smell was like something from a grave. "We have to get out of here," David whispered as they realized things had gotten even worse. There was an old fridge nearby, and even though they knew opening it was the worst thing they could do, they still moved toward it. Aaron pulled out the key and opened the fridge door. As soon as he did, an unbelievably foul stench of decay erupted from within. like it was being sucked in by some ominous virus. Inside were even more body parts, but what struck them was the date on one of the plastic containers. It was the same date their mother's accident happened. David grabbed his chest, his face drained of color, and Aaron remembered how, at the very beginning, their mother had constantly asked why they didn't want to believe her. She wasn't in the car, Aaron barely whispered. The shelves in the fridge were filled with records, but these weren't ordinary medical files. One of the reports stated that these experiments were the result of illegal operations. The entire documentation looked like something collected from underground medical facilities. And then, when they realized this wasn't an accident but a horrifying plan, their mother appeared on the stairs. Her face was covered in bandages, and she held a large, gleaming knife. Her voice was barely audible, but it was laced with desperate anger and spite. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered. Her eyes filled with the same terrifying light as that day of the accident. She moved quickly toward them. David and Aaron, barely processing what had just happened, ran toward the door, feeling their hearts thudding in their chests. They slammed the basement door shut, and their mother's screams echoed in the dark, shattering the stillness of the night. It wasn't just a moment of fear. It was the beginning of something they couldn't stop. The morning after that terrifying night, when the brothers narrowly escaped their mother's knife-wielding hands, everything seemed as if nothing had happened. Amanda appeared to be the same as before, gentle and calm. She was preparing breakfast, moving around the kitchen with the same balance she always had. Her voice was soft, and there was no trace of the dark, sinister energy they had seen the night before. But something wasn't right. Watching her, the brothers began to notice details that raised suspicion. First of all, the bandages she had been wearing on her face were gone. They weren't there anymore, and that immediately caught their attention. They stole glances at her face, trying to understand what had happened, and what they saw made them freeze in place. Her skin was unevenly stretched, as if her face had been sewn together from patches of skin. The lines on her face were rough, some areas looked swollen and red, while others were unnaturally pale. It was as if someone had relentlessly tried to restore her appearance, but with such brutal cruelty that it looked worse than any wound. Her face was deformed, and all her features seemed foreign, like a grotesque mask made from someone else's material. David and Aaron stood silently, watching as Amanda carried breakfast to the table, as if nothing had happened, then smiled at them the way she always did. But the smile wasn't the same. It was twisted, distorted, and in her eyes, that same ominous look returned, the one they had seen the night before. Chilled to the bone, the brothers began to understand that something had changed. Amanda was acting as though she was once again in control of the situation. But with every step she took, there was a new unsettling detail that made them feel more and more vulnerable. Soon, her behavior grew even stranger. Every action seemed filled with some cruel intent, as though she aimed to break them down internally. At first, it was little things. She threw away their phones, as if signaling that there would be no more communication, no more calling for help. Then she destroyed their personal belongings, as if she was smashing their very identities. But that wasn't enough. Amanda began leaving them notes. At first, they were just unpleasant with unreadable threats, but over time, they became more specific. "I know what you did. You will never leave here." Each word pierced them like cold blades. But the worst part was that Amanda was driving them to the edge of madness. She made them feel as though everything they saw was just their minds betraying them. This is how she made them doubt themselves, turning every moment into a nightmare. One night, when the brothers had fallen asleep, Aaron woke up to a strange feeling in the air. He didn't immediately understand what had happened, but then he saw a shadow approaching his bed. It was Amanda. She was sitting beside him, holding something shiny in her hands. Aaron could barely make out what it was, but then he saw the blade, cold and gleaming. Aaron felt his heart stop. He couldn't move, couldn't call for help. And at that moment, even the air seemed thick, preventing him from breathing. Only when Amanda realized he was awake did she smile again. Her face looked even more terrifying in the dark, with all her deformities resembling a horrific mask. The next day, the brothers decided they had to escape. They could no longer stay in that house. But Amanda anticipated their plan. They chose the basement window, but when they tried to open it, they saw it was booby-trapped. Connected wires leading to the lock showed that she was willing to go to any lengths to keep them from leaving. Her voice echoed from behind, "I won't let you leave me. You're all I have." And in her words, there was no hope of salvation. It was a promise that left no room for doubt. Aaron and David stood on the threshold of an inevitable nightmare, and their mother stood between them and freedom. She was ready to do anything to keep them under her control. And they knew this was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a battle for their souls. The night had fallen deep, and in the silence of the house, the only sound that could be heard was the soft echo of the brothers' footsteps, desperately trying to escape the trap. Aaron couldn't take it anymore. He could feel the surge of anger and despair ripping through his gut. They couldn't stand this any longer. The constant intimidation, that terrifying mask their mother wore. So that night, when she once again stood at the threshold of their nightmare, they decided to act. Aaron had it all planned. They knew that her paranoid fear was their only chance. She was terrified of the basement. She'd spent her life avoiding the dark, and this was their opportunity to lure her there, where they could finally make her pay for everything they had endured. They deceived her into believing they were trying to escape, when in reality, this was their final move, to end it once and for all. But she was one step ahead. She noticed what they were doing, and in that instant, her appearance changed. Her face became even more grotesque, her eyes lit with a savage fire. She knew this was her last chance to destroy them. In her hands gleamed a knife, cold and menacing, as though she was ready to cut them to their core. The brothers were cornered in the basement. She had driven them there, and despair filled their hearts. But in that moment, when they thought it was all lost, Aaron found a surge of resolve. He grabbed a heavy chain hanging in the corner and, without thinking, wrapped it around her neck. With such force, his hands trembled as he pulled, trying to strangle her. She fought back, thrashing, her face twisted with rage and pain, but Aaron didn't let go. David also rushed to help his brother, but just as everything seemed on the verge of victory, she made one final move. The knife in her hand flashed in the dark, and David felt a sharp pain in his side. He screamed as blood started soaking through his clothes. Aaron, seeing his brother drop to his knees, was momentarily distracted, giving her the chance to break free. She managed to escape, but the brothers knew they couldn't stop now. In the final moments, after a brutal struggle, they managed to restrain her. Their mother's hands were bound, but her gaze, full of hatred and contempt, still held an overwhelming power. She wasn't giving up. As they made their way out of the house, they no longer thought of themselves, only about leaving it all behind. They called the police, but when the authorities arrived, all they found was a trail of blood leading into the woods. She had vanished, as though she had never existed. Her tracks were lost among the dark trees, and in the brothers' hearts remained only bitterness. Uncertain whether they had truly saved themselves, or if this was just the beginning of an even worse nightmare. Months passed, and the news brought another chilling story. A woman with bandages on her face, suspected of brutal attacks, had been caught on camera several times. David, already in a rehab center, learned this from the news. Turned out their real mother had been killed. Instead, a serial killer had taken her place in the house, hiding her true identity behind the mask. She killed children because she had lost her own. On one unforgettable evening, her own daughter had been taken from her hands. Since then, she had begun her revenge, turning her family connections into a destructive mechanism. But in truth, she was just a lonely soul, desperately searching to replace the loss. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Maybe next time I'll reveal another mystery that will make you rethink everything that happened. Remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden where we least expect them.